I said, you know what? This semester, we're going to do something crazy. I took my syllabus, which was this kind of iterative lean startup process of how you build a company. And I just pushed Control F and I replaced every instance of the word startup with book.
Hi, I'm Danielle, and you're listening to Unboxing Humans. Eric Koester is the founder and CEO of Creator Institute, a B Corporation whose mission is to inspire, teach, and support tomorrow's creators. Authors, podcasters, speakers, entrepreneurs, corporate innovators, and course builders. Through his work, he has coached nearly 2,100 first-time creators. He is also a professor of entrepreneurship and innovation at Georgetown University, and the school's only two-time Entrepreneurship Professor of the Year, faculty at Growth University, and the executive director of the Entrepreneur Institute, which researches, trains, and develops future innovation leaders. Eric is the author of 5 books. Most recently, he published The Penny Wars, which you can learn more about at the link in the show notes. Eric, welcome to Unboxing Humans.
Hey, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Known you for a little bit now, about a year. Mm-hmm. And what was so interesting to me is as I was preparing for our conversation, I came across an endorsement on your LinkedIn that for a second made me think that maybe I was looking at the wrong Eric Koester. And it read, Eric is a terrific attorney. He was my startups counsel and negotiated several university transfer agreements. He also provided investment advice for VCs under consideration. I found his counsel to be invaluable, and I highly recommend him without reservation. And I was shocked because I had no idea that you started your career in law.
I did, yeah. I only tell my friends that one. So it's one of those secrets that I try not to tell because actually, funny enough, people often think that, oh, if you're an attorney, you must act and behave in a certain way and all these kind of things behind it. And so yeah, I started out actually, I spent about 5 years in big law after law school and enjoyed it. I learned a lot of things along the way, but the biggest thing that I would sort of say I took from it is it certainly teaches you how to think and solve problems, but also the challenge of being an attorney is you see the world through the lens of risk. You're always like looking for things that could stop you or start you, get you stuck or get you in trouble and I found that to not be a very like hopeful way of seeing the world, like looking at the downside all the time. So I found a way to turn that sort of into an upside, looking at like these things as opportunities. And I think that's kind of what I found a lot of entrepreneurs able to do is sort of see those opportunities in that way. So yeah, that was sort of, I spent that time working in the law world and got to operate at some of the highest levels of it. I got to play all kinds of interesting things, like help companies go public and do big deals and acquisitions and all this kind of stuff. And then got to take it out on the road and do my own sort of thing there.
That's so interesting. And you're so right about being very risk focused and knowing that is not how you operate. I'm curious, why did you think that was the career you wanted?
That's a good question. So it's funny. I actually approached it in a very logical way of why I decided to go into that. So when I was, just after college, I was very, very ambitious. I had all these sort of big aspirations and dreams. And I thought as I really spent time like looking at what I wanted to do or be, I realized that I at the time wanted to eventually become the CEO of a public company. My goal was to become the leader of a large company. And I didn't really know what or where or when, but I thought that was kind of my goal behind it. So I looked at that as a goal, saying like, eventually I want to run a company and I want to be a leader in it. And I studied those people. So I went out and studied a whole bunch of different things and started to get data on it. And what I found was very interesting is of the people that are public company CEOs, more of them actually have a JD than have an MBA. So as I was thinking a little bit about like kind of what my path would be, I thought, okay, well, the logical path for me would, as a business undergrad would be to go and get an MBA. But the path that I thought would help me skip the line and get there fastest was to become a lawyer. So that was what I did. I got my JD. But then what was interesting is like part of what they don't tell you, or maybe part of the thing that I didn't realize is you incur a lot of debt to do this one. So, once you've got 6 figures of debts from law school, you got to pay for it. And it turned out the best paying jobs were in big law firms. So I sort of readjusted things and said, okay, maybe the best path for me is that I'm going to go out and do this for a number of years, pay off my loans, get some more experience, and then jump into it. And kind of along the way, when I started working more with startup companies and started working more in venture capital, I started to go back to my roots, which were I was starting companies when I was in high school. I was doing that kind of entrepreneurial stuff even while I was in undergrad and law school. And so I realized, like, okay, maybe I don't want to become a CEO at a public company, but I do want to sort of do my own thing. And so I used my experience in law to eventually make the leap into startups and eventually started my own. And here we are now, kind of on my own path.
I never knew that most CEOs of public companies have JDs, not MBAs.
Yeah. And I think part of it is when you start to understand, like, kind of like why that is the case. I think a lot of it, there's a couple of reasons why. Number one, the MBA degree is newer. So part of it to know is like the MBA degree didn't really sort of rise to prominence until like the 80s and 90s. So there's a lag, right? Like there are more people getting them, but they're less, it's less, just the time horizon is longer. But number two, I think a lot of it also to know is that the pathway into becoming the CEO is often through a C-suite spot. So a general counsel, a chief operating officer, a CFO, those are roles that oftentimes the pathway in is more likely to have a JD. So I think those are the other pieces of it. And so that's really where you start to sort of understand the why. And I get it, right? Entirely, I think that what you'll start to figure out as you see the public company CEOs is they're dealing with logistical complexity, they're navigating these things. And so there really is something about that like problem solver mindset. But it was an interesting learning for me. And again, I think for me, I went into it with a very thoughtful approach of why. And I think ultimately I was open to the fact that life would change a little bit. So it wasn't that I sometimes people say, do you regret going to law school? And I don't regret going to law school. I think that at the time I, used the decision making to do it. That said, I think that what I would tell most people today is, I think if your goal is to use, people come to me all the time, like, hey, I want to go to law school so that I can something else. And my real advice today is, especially if you're spending, $200,000 or $300,000, which many times you are now to go to a top law school, you should really want to be a lawyer because that's like the pathway. And oftentimes the segues out are not as easy or as obvious as you might actually want.
I'm curious about these businesses you started in high school that really led to your entrepreneurial spirit.
Yeah, I mean, I was probably one of those kids that was very much like unusual in a lot of the ways that I saw it. So just to take for context standpoint, I mean, I think a lot of what's interesting today is the entrepreneurship as a profession was not really a profession 20 years ago, right? So I graduated from high school in 1999, like right at the start of the .com, explosion and those sorts of things. But that's when I graduated college, excuse me. So I graduated from high school in 95. But in that window of time, entrepreneurship was not something that people did. And there was bunches of reasons why, I'm sure. But part of it was just there was no real normal path into that one. So I'll tell you an interesting story that will like give context to this one. So I started my first company, like my first real company when I was in high school. There was a family friend of ours who was who had lived in the US and then had moved over to Asia to live in Korea and Taiwan. And they were doing all this work, but they're having a hard time getting information. And so they hired me to do a bunch of research and work for them. I would go to the libraries, I would create all these things, all these reports, and I would sell them back over to businessmen and women over in Asia. And so I created this consulting company and it was really great. It was working well. I started actually publishing my work. My first book actually was a published version of some of this research I was doing in plastics recycling and environmental technology, all that kind of stuff. And so that was my first foray into that one. I went to college and I continued to do this work. Like that was my summer jobs. That was my side stuff. But then what's really interesting is I was a business school student. So I was studying finance and marketing. And this is a true story. My senior year, I was trying to figure out what my next step were. And so I had all these interesting things. I was very much involved in like student leadership positions. I had done a bunch of stuff in the business school. And I had this side business that was paying for my college. Like that's what I was doing. It was covering all that sort of stuff. And so the college had a formal mentorship program where they matched you with someone. Now, as you know, I've written a book about mentorship today, and I can talk about that a little bit. But part of the thing that I learned is that was actually the reason that I had a really bitter taste about mentorship. I got paired up with someone who was fine, but basically didn't really know anything about me, just knew about his own path. And so I
Mhm.
told him, like, I've got this company, I've got these things, and the company was fine, right? It was producing really good earnings for me as a college student. And he told me, if you want to be taken seriously, you need to work at a serious company. Like, you should shut your company down. And I really didn't have any reason to push back on him. There was no entrepreneurship program at my college. There was no people that I met who were entrepreneurs. If you wanted to be a business person, you work at a business place. So I shut my company down, like this company that was doing well. And in retrospect, it was one of the dumbest things I ever did. And the reason for it was I was making around $30,000 like a year from like the earnings. And that was, again, like as a part-time thing. I quit, took a job at Morgan Stanley as kind of one of their investment analyst persons, and I was making $23,000 a year in that way. And a lot of it was because I don't think I really realized there was no clear picture of like what entrepreneurship was. I didn't have mentors, I didn't have support behind it. So a lot of the reason I now teach and spend a lot of time like helping people be entrepreneurs is I think that many times people have this perspective of like, what is the path or what does it look like? Or if they don't know entrepreneurship, they discount it. And so that was really how I kind of made that, I took this almost a detour in my career for about 10 to 15 years until I really formally got back into entrepreneurship. But a lot of it was that bad advice from a really bad mentor that kind of derailed me a little bit. And again, I'm not like blaming the person. He just did what he thought he should do, is give you advice based on his context. But I don't think at that time we really understood how the internet was going to change entrepreneurship and why it really was a viable career path for a lot of people.
I think that mindset is still so true today.
Yeah.
Like, how many people say like, oh, I would love to start some sort of consultancy, whether that's coaching or freelance or whatever that looks like. Say, oh, but no one's going to take me seriously because I've never worked at a big company in this space. And then they don't do it. And I mean, you see with people writing books all the time as well.
Yeah. It's actually, there's a term for this, and it's a term that was originally coined, or the person I attribute to is a guy named Justin Welsh, who calls it knowledge blindness. And I think what we wind up having a challenge with is we are blind to the knowledge that we have that actually is valuable. And I think a lot of people wrestle with this behind it. And a lot of it is because of the fact that we look to others for knowledge for ourselves, and we don't look to sort of see who needs the knowledge of who we were in the past. And so a lot of the reason for knowledge blindness is I think that we are very quick to forget what we needed to get to where we needed to go. And so I think we look and say, well, I want to be Adam Grant or I want to be Brene Brown, and think like, well, no one's going to take me seriously because I'm not them today. But the reality is they weren't them when they started. And so you have to kind of work backwards. And so I think a lot of what I always urge people to do as they're thinking about paths, careers, life, whatever it is to really understand like what is the knowledge that they have that could have been valuable to them at some point in their past. And that, I think, is really where the gap comes in, is knowledge blindness. And especially if you wanted to start to do coaching, do consulting, do speaking, do whatever it is it's not about like the peers that you have today or the aspirational peers that you have tomorrow. It's the people that you were a peer of 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 years ago. And that's, I think, where a lot of people's gaps are, is they fail to realize that like, hey, what you actually know today is something that you probably would have paid money for 2 to 3 to 4 or 5 years ago. And if you could build a business around that one, you have a lot of knowledge that's monetizable.
I totally agree with that. I've even realized it myself. I started coaching someone on her startup because a friend knew this person and said, I don't know if this is like what you do. She needs help launching her business. Can you just talk to her? And I said, oh yeah, always happy to talk to someone who's launching a company. And as we were talking, she said, you need to be my coach. Like, you need to be my consultant. I need you. And I was like, this all is just in my head. I had no idea that like it's not in other people's heads and they could actually really use my advice. And then the same thing happened with my speaking and actually with writing a book. I said, I would love to talk to you about it in 15 minutes. And they were like, you saved my life. I said, I had no idea that this stuff that I sort of figured out on my own, it is probably like very succinctly in there. And this is just the steps that I took, and here you go. And usually part of that is do book creators. So let's turn into that for a minute. So you were in the startup space. Tell me how you ended up at Georgetown.
So it was an interesting process for me. I mean, so I think all these things for me are a lot of ways interrelated. It's to think about like, what were so I spend a lot of time thinking about like, you know, how do you actually help people? And I think that's kind of an interesting journey for me. So, I had this interesting career path, right? Where I had started companies, took this kind of detour, went to law school, started working in the legal field. And I was sort of finding myself at this point where I was stuck. I saw the pathway that, yeah, I could stay at a law firm and I could kind of, eventually keep going and become a partner. But it felt like it was not where I wanted to go, number one. And number two, it just felt like it was a long, long drawn out path. Or I could quit and go do something else or start over in that way. And so I really found myself kind of at this stuck point where I was trying to figure out like, how do I actually like get to where I want to go? But I don't know if I necessarily want to like that is and what that looks like. And so as luck would have it, I got connected with a publisher. And this publisher had known that I'd published a book in the past in this sort of, interesting space. They'd seen me speaking at a conference, and the woman, Allison Schenken, my acquiring editor, said, "Hey, have you thought about writing a book?" And I was like, "I have, in fact. I just, I never really like put pen to paper to do it for this new thing." So what happened to me is when I was working at the law firm, I wrote and published a book. Now, I will tell you, it was incredibly intimidating for me to do. Here I am, a third or fourth year associate, and I'm writing a book about the legal and the business side of startups. And all these senior partners are around me like, "Who are you? What are you doing?" And yet it had this incredible impact on me. Suddenly my life started to change. I started to be invited to serve on boards. I started to have clients coming to me, and I started to really see my life change. And so really what helped me make the leap from being an attorney who was sort of unhappy with the path and wasn't really where he wanted to go was I created this thing. I created this book. And what actually happened, this is a funny true story, is I had been in this place where I was sort of stuck. I was, trying to figure out what I was going to do. And so I really decided like, well, what I needed to do was I was going to get a bunch of startup clients as an attorney, as a startup attorney. And people didn't take me seriously. They're like, "Who are you? What are you? Like, you're just another attorney." In fact, there was a guy named Kabir Shahani, and Kabir was someone that I'd reached out to. In fact, I met him at an event. I sent him a LinkedIn request and he blocked it. And I was like, "But I already met you and you're not doing this one." So I wrote this book, and then afterwards, I basically gave it to him at an event. And true story, within the next 3 months, he hired me to be his attorney from the firm. And then 3 months later after that, he actually asked me to come in and be the chief operating officer of the startup that he was at. That kind of got me in the door, helped this company grow. And eventually I used that to segue my own company, and the rest was history. So I got this whole thing. Well, part of what was interesting about that experience too is that like this creation event, this thing that I created changed the way people perceive me. I'm not just an attorney. I'm not just a young guy. I'm not this person. Suddenly now people saw me in this different way. So much so that I actually got invited to start teaching classes at Berkeley and Stanford and NYU with a guy named Steve Blank. And so all these things happened to me in these crazy, bunch of stories. Like I moved in really basically about a 1-year period from this guy who was stuck to a guy who published a book, suddenly had these opportunities, and suddenly got to start his own company, was raising capital from Ashton Kutcher, all these kind of cool things happened. And so the reason that I got into Georgetown was that. Like, it wasn't because I was some smart guy. I wouldn't have gotten into Georgetown as an undergrad, but here I am, like, having these interesting experiences. And now I moved to DC, and someone's like, "Oh, wow, you must know something." I probably didn't know anything, but I had enough evidence that I did that they hired me to start to teach. And so that was really kind of how I moved into that one. My primary role is I'm an entrepreneur. I start things, I create things behind it. But I got invited to teach at Georgetown entrepreneurship as a guy who wouldn't have got in there as an undergrad, who really was relatively young in the field that way. But I got invited in because of these sort of sets of things that I kind of created my own path in. And it really all did start with publishing a book.
So when all of these partners were looking at you and saying, "What business do you have?" What made you keep going and say like, "Yeah, I am going to put this thing out there, even though I sort of don't feel qualified to do so"?
Yeah, so I think it's a couple things that come into that one. And I think a lot of people that I meet who are ambitious are wrestling through some form of imposter syndrome. And I think imposter syndrome really can manifest itself in two different outcomes. One version of imposter syndrome says, "I'm not qualified, therefore I'm not going to do it." Or I'm not qualified, and therefore I'm going to work harder to make sure that I can prove that I am worth it. And I took the second path, which is I used it as a challenge behind it. So for me, this sort of fear that I had, or this nervousness or this discomfort that I felt, I used it as a way to work harder, to learn more, to engage more people. And so I think a lot of that's what happens to people is they don't realize that they're making a choice when they are. And I think you have two paths at any time. Is number one, to say, yeah, they're probably right. Or number two, I will probably prove them wrong. And if you choose the I will probably prove them wrong, it just unlocks extra work. You have to work really hard. And I did. I worked really, really hard. I interviewed a lot of people, had help. I had all these things behind it. So that was really, I guess, the biggest thing is first, I made a choice of how I was going to let imposter syndrome manifest. And then number two, I was going to work my tail off to basically prove them wrong. So that chip on your shoulder, I think, is a way that I did it. But number two, I think the other part of it, both versus having I'll prove them wrong, is how. How do you prove them wrong? And so I think this is where it's an interesting thing that I've learned a lot about is the difference between having goals and having systems. And so I think a lot about that too is like, it is a goal to publish a book, or is a goal to do, to put out a podcast, or it's a goal to whatever it is. The one thing to make sure of is that your goals are not positive fantasies, right? Like they're just these things I believe behind it. Because I think if you really want to tell me your goals are not just positive fantasies, I want to see the systems, the accountability, the coaching, the investments you make in that one. So when people ask me about that process, again, of like producing something this way, I hired editors who worked with me and helped me on these ways. I hired researchers, college students who helped me. I interviewed a whole bunch of smart people. I talked to lots of people along the way, and I worked really hard to learn these things behind it. And so at the end of the day, like when I did put it out, it was my best work. I really worked hard at it and I really did it. Now, all of that is to simply say that like the reason that it was so good is because I was going to make damn sure it was so good, that kind of way behind it. Now, I think the other part that's important in those ones too, is I think that there's oftentimes we have this, again, this sort of blindness to what we don't even know. And so I think that's the other thing when people tackle new things like writing a book or whatever it may be, is that we oftentimes go into it saying like, okay, like, I'll figure it out. And I actually think that's a bad attitude as well. Like, I don't think like the figured it out is a good approach for most. I mean, sure, there are those things, but I think figure it out with who. And so part of it for me is I interviewed other authors, I talked to other people, I got feedback from those folks. I really spent a lot of time with my editor to learn these things. And so I think that's kind of where it was for me is, again, I made that first choice, which is to say, I am going to basically not believe what they say, but use it as a motivation to become who I, believe that I can be. Really started to develop systems. And so again, really understanding those systems, I had time on the calendar, I blocked stuff out, I had accountability, that kind of stuff. And the third one was really understanding that there is a craft to a lot of these things, right? You go to school to learn certain things, but if you're learning to write a book, or you're learning to put on a really great podcast, or you're learning to put on an event, really learn from people who are great at the craft and not try to say, I'll figure it out, but you can skip a lot of steps behind it. So I think that's kind of how I got to the point where I was able to do something that had those kind of outcomes for me.
I was just listening to someone else's podcast, and they were talking about that very same concept of the difference between manifesting, basically, and manifesting like with an action plan. They said so many people get the high from envisioning what their life will be. So they're like, oh my God, I am going to be, a world famous actress, for example, right? And they just get so high and so happy thinking about that life, and they forget to make the actual plan to make it happen. And so then a week, months, years go by, and like it hasn't happened because the plan part actually puts it into place. So it's so funny that in the course of a week, I'm hearing this same thing twice. So goal and plan for sure.
So and I'm even thinking more than just plan, right? I think plan is a interesting phrase, like an interesting word. I really do think that success today comes from systems. And the difference to me between a plan and a system is a plan is something that oftentimes has these sorts of like longer term things. I'm going to plan to do this sort of stuff, versus systems are things that have a self-reinforcing mechanism, right? And I think part of that really comes down to a lot of what I've learned about helping authors. And I'm very fortunate now. I've worked with 2,100 authors now, yourself included, like 300 national book awards and finalists. And I think what really is interesting into it is that so many times people have this milestone, this goal, but they don't really build systems behind it of how are you going to basically get time on the calendar? How are you going to get iterative feedback? And so I think that that's really a big part of it. And that's even why I push back a little bit on this idea of like building habits. I think habits are a good thing and atomic habits, there's all this sort of stuff out there behind it. But I really think about this idea of building systems. And systems are things that are designed to kind of like, continue to make progress as they're going along the way. And I think eventually systems can become habits. But I think that part of the idea of a habit is that like you build good habits in these ways. And I think that you build good systems that lead to good habits behind it. And I think that's a lot of it. Like, again, a lot of people, they have this great idea of writing a book, or they have this idea of doing this thing, and they may even have a plan for it. Like, I'm going to finish this thing at this point and that sort of stuff. But I do think systems are really, really hard for a lot of people. And I think that they think just because they're motivated or whatever it is, it'll work. But the systems are really where the magic happens.
To me, the difference between the habit and the system is also that systems can be updated.
Yep.
Right. Habits are very fixed. It's a habit. I always do it. I always do it in the same way. But you can evaluate the system and tweak it and make it better if it's not working for you.
Yeah. I also think the other part about it, I think the part of the reason habits get this interesting thing is that we ascribe motivation to habits. So if you're motivated, you will build these habits in that way. And and again, I understand why we talk about it in those ways. Systems are designed to basically create the accountability, the motivation, that kind of way for it. So I think part of it is that people imagine if I were motivated enough, I would build a habit. And I think that's kind of the wrong message. I think if you build a system, it will reinforce accountability and motivation to keep you going. So I think part of it is really, my sense to people is if they're thinking about, again, whatever it may be, but we'll just use a book, which is a good example, is that I think a lot of times people think like, if I just had the right topic, then I would build motivation and do this sort of stuff. And my sense is if you just built the systems to build a book, you will find the right topic along the way and eventually create that book. But I think it's a starting problem is that people fascinated by the idea or whatever it is versus the systems that create the output. So that's why, again, with most authors, I'm not really that worried about what their topic is at the beginning, right? I mean, yours, like most people's, evolved a lot. And that's okay. But part of it is once you build the system, then you basically make progress and you can have something to evolve versus in your head saying like, gosh, if I just had this thing, I'd be motivated. So that's why I say systems are important, because systems allow you to make progress, even if you're not totally sure of where that's progressing to yet, but you made progress and you're likely to figure it out along the way.
I love that distinction. I think it's going to help so many people as they listen. Like, oh my God, the system's in place. Let's talk about how you created the system then with a book creator. If I'm remembering the story correctly, you basically threw out your class and said, we're writing a book.
Yeah, it was basically it. Yeah, it was really interesting. I mean, I was teaching a class at Georgetown about startups, and I was, it was a fun process. I enjoyed working with students, but it was make-believe, like a lot of what it is. So, and again, I totally understand why. Most, 19, 20, 21-year-old people are not at a point in their lives where they're ready to go all in and start a company. In fact, I don't encourage most people to do it, right? Most successful startup founders are in their 40s, right? So like, it just takes time to build experience and networks and resources, those kind of things. So I found myself very unfulfilled because it was make-believe, right? Not a lot of my students were going on to start companies, or almost none. And so I decided to sort of see, could I actually help them learn the techniques of entrepreneurship, but by replacing this idea of a startup with a different product. So I had written these books in my 20s. They were really powerful for me. So I said, you know what? This semester, we're going to do something crazy. I took my syllabus, which was this kind of iterative lean startup process of how you build a company. And I just pushed Control F and I replaced every instance of the word startup with book. And then we went for it. Now, what I didn't realize at the time was that really what I was building was a system that we knew worked to build a company or a startup, this sort of iterative process. We know it works. Like we've seen the data behind it, but no one had really quite done that in the idea of building a book, where you just replace this idea of this business startup, but make the book as the product. Now, the reason it worked so well is number one, like it's something that's accessible to a lot of people. The idea of creating a book is something that, in college, you write papers. We just write more words. But the second thing that was really interesting behind it is that books are really, really difficult to finish, right? They're really hard. Like, less than 2% of people that start a book, according to the New York Times, will ever finish it. And so a lot of what we needed to do was build a system to keep them progressing along the way. And it was wild to watch, right? Like the fact of the matter is, if like 1% of people start a book will finish it. The class, 95% of people were finishing a book, number one, and their book was having these really great outcomes into it. So that's really what happened here, is this idea of like basically taking a system that I knew worked with something else and just porting it into this other product. And voila, we had something pretty special. So that's really was the start of this thing. Originally, it started as a college course. I started letting other people from other schools sit into it. And then COVID happened. And really quickly, people were like, oh my God, can I write a book with you? And so we built this organization called Manuscripts. Manuscripts is a B corporation. We're a social venture with this mission to empower underheard voices in books and publishing. And we basically took this process and started putting people through it. And it was wild, right? Suddenly, like, we found ourselves in this really interesting space where people were creating books, having really amazing outcomes. And I think we figured out a way to build a system behind a book where most people had always thought of a book as this artistic process. You're inspired, you push through the pain. Whereas we built a system that has very reliable outcomes, has really, really high, ROI for people in it. And so I think really what evolved over the last couple of years is we realized that we're a community-driven process behind books. And so Manuscripts is now really like the top, one of the top publisher or top like 10 publisher in the planet now in terms of the books we produce, but also the number one publisher in terms of the amount of award-winning books that we produce. And it's because we build a system that helps people A, finish what they start, and B, iterate to get to what the outcome really is. So that's really how this thing came to be. And I've taken my last 2 books through it, and both of them have done remarkably well because it's system. It's not some kind of magical thing where you're motivated enough. Frankly, there's a lot of days where I'm not motivated, but the system will not let a lack of motivation stop me. And that's, I think, what we found and why I think it works so well.
For those who aren't familiar with lean startup and starting a company, what is that parallel? So what is the system that you can then plug a product like a book into and magically happens, but not magically?
Yeah, I mean, so
system.
Yeah, the interesting thing is to compare this is why it was so, I didn't really realize it at the time, but it's very analogous to a book. So the historical system behind building software products was something called the waterfall method. And so the way that it worked is you would have a plan, and then basically people would execute on these plans to finish the entire thing. So here's the plan. And then 2 years later, we now have the software. And it was this waterfall process to sort of do that one. Well, the challenge is that because you start with the plan, people didn't change things to basically react to feedback in that way. So what happened is 2 years later, now you have a piece of software that sort of doesn't reflect the current realities of it. So the idea was to sort of say is how can you do something that is more about speed of iteration? So getting feedback faster. So rather than sort of like the smart person comes with the plan, you hope you're right, and 2 years later you have the outcome. Instead, how can you get iterative feedback much faster? And so lean startup is really this methodology where you design experiments and you would experiment on something. You would basically build something. You would, measure the result and you would iterate along the way. And so the idea is that cycle time through it. So that was really what the key is when you're building a company today. It's so much about scoping, feedback from customers, scoping, products, whatever it is in these smaller senses so you can get feedback on it. Well, funny enough, when you think about a book, is books actually are pretty much designed by the waterfall method. Someone comes up with an idea as an author and they write this whole entire thing and then they give it to some editor or publisher and they say, yeah, we don't like it. And so what do you have to do? You have to go very back to the beginning and start all over again. So the cycle times are super, super long and super challenging. So what we started doing is saying every week you should write some stuff and get feedback on it. And so now that's really what our secret is the reason that we can help authors reliably put out some of the best books in the world is because every week they're getting feedback from a book architect or the development or their launch coach or their beta reader community. And so that cycle is really what's important in it and really in any creative project, right? For the most part, the faster you can be getting feedback, the faster you make progress. Now, the secondary benefit of this one too is that one of the things that's interesting about books is people quit them at a remarkably high rate, right? Like 80+% of people have write a book on their bucket list. And yet like 1 to 2% of people will ever finish it. Why? It's because they go along the way and realize they lose motivation or they don't have the right track. The reason is because basically they see this whole long process of like several years to then be told maybe to go back in the beginning. And so if they get feedback along the way, it helps them optimize and stay the path behind it. So that's really, I think, what the aha is like, if you treat a book like a startup in this lean startup way, the results will be much bigger because you'll be getting customer feedback and expert feedback along the way. And oh, by the way, motivation won't stop. It'll just evolve in that way. And that's why I think we just see these remarkable rates. Like something like 85% of people will finish a manuscript that's publishable in about 8 months with us. And that's just because of the fact that they're not spending 2 years, gnashing their teeth. They're basically getting feedback every way to make sure that this will be publishable for them.
And then on top of that, they are building this audience the whole way and building this deep connection with their readers.
It's an interesting thing too. And I think it's another big aha that we had. And this is something to know about books for anyone who's thinking about a book, is that when you really understand, you talk to someone who reads books. The average reader of a book that is published tells 0 people about it when they read it. So the problem is like you have something that has 0 inherent virality. You publish this product and there's no referrals, there's no thing. That said, what we find is when someone gets involved in the book, right? When someone, buys a ticket to a launch event and gets to read it early, the beta reader, on average, they tell 3 to 5 people. And so, one of the projects that I tested this on is I did a kid's book with my kid. So this is called Pennymores. And it's been a remarkably interesting project for me. It was a bedtime story with my kids and has now become kind of a full story, like Harry Potter-ish sort of story. And, what's interesting behind it is like, I've never written fiction before. I don't have connections in the fiction space. I'm not a teacher. I don't have any of those kind of people behind it. And so the average novel, when it's, again, first time novel, it sells like less than 100 copies lifetime. So it's very, very difficult to do. And yet Pennymores in its first 18 months has sold over 20,000 copies. Why? Well, the key reason why is because I wanted to make sure it was good. So I actually reached out to a whole bunch of people who are, authors in the community, friends of mine who have young kids, whatever it is, and had almost 900 people get involved in the book before it was done, through the launch event, through beta reading, whatever like that. And all those people now feel like it's their book. So what's interesting about creating this community around it is we have created word of mouth. So if I'd waited instead of said it's done and got it out there, either it wouldn't be very good, or even if it was good, people just don't inherently share things. That said, in this way, every person involved basically told people. And so in the first week the book was published, so remember, we had almost 1,000 people get involved in the book before it was done. In the first week, their word of mouth led to almost 5,000 sales in the first 10 days of the book. So that's really what's important to understand, is that you want to build community today, and audience building happens before something is done, not, hey, look at what I've got, will you buy it, versus will you see what I'm doing, will you be a part of it? That's the distinction. Not look at what I've done, will you buy it, versus look at what we're doing, will you be a part of it? And that distinction makes a huge difference in any thing that you're doing, but in particular, we find with books.
There's an authenticity to it also, right? Sure. It shifts from, oh, this person's just trying to sell me something, into this person cares about what I think. But I'm curious, at a level of 900 people, how do you manage what 900 people might think and take the feedback that feels right to you?
Yeah, the first thing to recognize too is that I think in general, you act like a benevolent dictator, right? You take the feedback and you sort of see what works in it. But I think people oftentimes want to be asked, not necessarily need to have your feedback taken. I think a couple of things that I would sort of share is I had 900 people read it. Not everyone even gave much feedback. Many people are like, oh, this is great. I love it. This is congratulations. This is awesome. Or they gave feedback on the cover or whatever it is. So I think the key thing to know is we oftentimes think that people are going to have inordinate amounts of feedback. And God, I wish people would give more feedback is sort of what I would say behind it, is the first thing. So that wasn't a hard part behind it. But I do think what was probably more important was dedicating the time to make it feel authentic, right? In those kind of ways. Managing that many relationships was hard. And so a lot of it was like spending a lot of time, sending text messages and Facebook messages to those people. So that was probably the harder thing. I didn't fully realize how much energy and time it would take to maintain that many relationships, because it wasn't like I'm just posting on social media, what do you think? It was I'm reaching out one-on-one, and that also led to the results. So like one of my early readers was a woman named Courtney. I went to college with her. She had a young son at the time, and she volunteered to read it to him. And she sent me a message about a week or so after she got the manuscript and said, hey, I've been dreading sending this message, but Finn hates it. Like we read it for 3 days and he begged me to stop reading it. I don't know how to tell you this one, but I just want to share. I was like, all right, perfect. First off, That sucks. Second off, thank you for sharing it. And third off, where did this happen? Like, where did you see those drop-off points? So I could figure out things. I learned things there along the way so I could fix stuff. And I realized I had a little boy problem. Like, little girls loved it, but little boys didn't love it in the same ways because they thought about it differently. So part of it is knowing that, like, yeah, sure. Like, I didn't love negative feedback, but if I hadn't done it this way, I wouldn't have figured out what I figured out. And Penny Morse is actually named a finalist for Book of the Year for the middle grade and kid category on Goodreads. Unbelievably exciting news, but it's because of people like Courtney and her feedback that it became what it became.
That's incredible. And I think that's such an interesting lesson on both sides, because so often we don't want to give people negative feedback because we're like, oh, I don't want to hurt their feelings. But if I think about the times I grew most as a person or in my career, it was someone saying, like, frankly, it just doesn't land with me. And the other thing I'm hearing is like this concept of aligning your network. And I think it happens in book creators, but it also happens with beta testers and beta readers, is because it's so hard when you're sitting alone, right? And we learned this concept in my MBA that if you want to achieve a goal, surround yourself with other people achieving that goal.
Yep.
And the hardest thing for any creator is like, does anyone care?
Yeah. Yep.
Truly, right? Like, I'm sitting here, I'm doing my thing. If I stop today, would it even matter? And so like aligning the network by joining a community of other authors writing and having that accountability, as you were saying, but also here's a bunch of people who really care and who are waiting and who want to give you that feedback. So you're going to keep going because you feel it.
Yep. Exactly right. Yeah. And I think for a lot of people, I think in general, they desire feedback, but ultimately I think there's a type of way to get the right feedback in it too. And so I call it positively productive, right? You want to pick the right people for that feedback that, have your interests at heart, but ultimately they're giving you feedback that's designed not to dissuade you from doing something, but to make it better. And so for Courtney, I knew that she actually was doing it out of a place of positivity, and she wasn't telling me to kill the project, but she was saying it didn't land with him behind it. And so that's, I think, an important thing to know is feedback is important to identify who gave it and ultimately to understand, is there a way for you to make the better outcome that you want? And that's important.
It's the feedback versus criticism. Yeah. No one's giving negative feedback to hurt you. People are criticizing to hurt you. Right. And it's
exactly right.
Knowing that difference. Well, Eric, thank you so much for joining me today. This was so wonderful. Since you've made it to the end of the show, I'm going to take a wild guess that you enjoyed listening. So go ahead, check out the links in the show notes and give us a follow. We both know you want to. Unboxing Humans is hosted by me, Danielle Boris. To learn more about my work, go to danielleboris.com. And don't forget to grab your copy of my new book, The Energy of Weirdos. See you next week and have a fantastic rest of your day.